I'm Lynda Kinkade. Welcome. Tonight, Brexit deadlock. The British Prime Minister now calling for a December general election. But there's a catch. Also, global outrage from the Middle East to Latin America. Protesters around the world demanding their governments look after them. And new details in the murder investigation involving dozens of people found dead in the back of a truck outside London. Well, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he will give Parliament more time to agree to a Brexit deal, but only if a general election is held on December 12th. This is the Prime Minister's third request for an early election. And in order to make it happen, he needs to secure two-thirds parliamentary majority, which includes the opposition. Mr. Johnson spoke about the Brexit deadline a short time ago.
The reason for having that deadline is because otherwise I don't think the people of this country are going to believe that Parliament is really going to do it by that deadline, because they spent 3.5 years failing to do it. So let's get it done and let's come out of the EU.
Boris Johnson now, well, the Leader of the House of Commons says a motion for a general election will be introduced on Monday. Our senior international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson joins us now from London. Nick, good to have you with us. So Boris Johnson needing two-thirds of majority to push through this election, which would make it the shortest parliamentary session in British history. What's the chance we'll see an election before Christmas?
You know, I think the chance is still on the table, but it might not be of the Prime Minister's making. You know, there could be, all the opposition parties could get together and have a vote of no confidence in him, which would mean there would be an opportunity to form their own government, which is something they talked about before. They couldn't get the agreement on it, but maybe the position has changed. Excuse me. It doesn't appear to me at this stage, and, you know, I think MPs are clearly going to go away and think about this, that Boris Johnson is going to find that he can get two-thirds support for this. It seems that most of the Labour MPs that we've been listening to in Parliament and outside Parliament speaking subsequent to the Prime Minister saying this, you know, are not going to go for it. And one of the reasons the Labour Party is not going to go for it, or is unlikely to go for it, is because they won't do as well in the elections as the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister knows that. He sent a letter to the Leader of the Opposition saying, look, if I win, then the deal's going to go through. But if you win, of course, you can organise another extension with the European Union. You can get a whole new deal. You can put it to a second referendum with the people of the country. You know, essentially, you know, go for the election. If you win, you can have what you want. It's a challenge, if you will. But I think Boris Johnson, and certainly when you look at the polls at the moment, Boris Johnson can feel more confident about election than the Leader of the Opposition. But it's not clear at this time that Boris Johnson would actually come back with a majority and actually do what he says he'd be able to do.
So, Nick, I was looking at the calendar. 1 week to go until the Brexit deadline of October 31st. Certainly not going to happen. We know the EU leaders are weighing this flexible extension. What are they likely to come back with tomorrow?
You know, what was really interesting today was the fact that the French ambassador was seen going into Downing Street. Of course, Boris Johnson said he was never going to negotiate on this extension. He sent the letter that he had to extend, that was a 3-month extension. But one of the things that he put in his letter to Jeremy Corbyn, the Leader of the Opposition, was, you know, if the European Union gives us an extension until maybe the 15th or the 30th of November, he said to Jeremy Corbyn, then I assume you'll work with me to try to ratify the deal, get the Brexit deal through Parliament. But he said, but if the extension is to the 31st of January next year, the whole 3-month extension, then we must go for the election. So I think when the Prime Minister comes out on national TV and says, this is it, you know, I want the opposition to support a general election, I think this is telegraphing that the Prime Minister seems to believe that the European Union is going to give that full-length extension. But again, you know, we have to say here, and I know this is terribly complicated, and it's complicated and complex to cover, but there's a lot of moving parts here, and really we follow them day by day. But this is, in essence, it's the Prime Minister saying to the Leader of the Opposition, put up or shut up. You said that you would go for a general election if the European Union said or removed the possibility of a no-deal Brexit. Now is the time to do it. This is a challenge. It's pure politics, but it's, you know, and we're watching it play out hour by hour.
Yeah, it certainly is complicated, and certainly legislation that is going to affect generations to come. Thanks for clarifying it all for us. We will stay on this story and talk to you again very soon. Thanks so much, Nick. And Nick Robertson there in London. Well, from Beirut to San Diego, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are venting their anger at their governments. Protests across the world may have been sparked by different issues, but their message is loud and clear. Enough is enough. Lebanon saw the largest demonstrations in a decade. A 20 cents a day tax on WhatsApp calls, those calls made via the internet, lit the fuse there, but it morphed into a cry for the downfall of the government. In Chile, police fired water cannons and tear gas, and a curfew was extended. A proposed hike in fares for subway tickets sparked those protests. But first, I want to look at the situation in Lebanon, where the president addressed the nation earlier today. Michel Aoun told protesters that their rallies would not be wasted. He promised to fight state corruption, which he said had eaten the country to the bone. Mr. Aoun says he'll listen to the protesters' demands, but had this word of caution.
I heard many calls for regime change. The regime doesn't change by protesting on the ground. Sure, our regime needs developing because it has spent years in paralysis.
Well, Lebanon's protests have largely been peaceful. Let's get the latest from our senior international correspondent, Ben Wiedemann, who joins us now from Beirut. Ben, good to see you there. So these protests essentially was sparked by this tax on WhatsApp phone calls, this daily tax. But that was just the spark. This anger we are seeing is so widespread, and we're seeing it right around the world, and it seems to be largely to do with this growing problem of inequality.
That's right, Lynda, but really I think in this case inequality is just a symptom of something much deeper, and that is really the economic system that exists here, which is crony capitalism, where a small group of people with access to power game the system, become obscenely rich, leave the vast majority behind. And what we're seeing, not just here in Lebanon, but in many places across the Arab world and around the world, is that many people are saying they're simply not going to put up with it anymore. Revolution, they chant. It's now a week since protests broke out across Lebanon. A general strike began Monday. Banks, schools, and universities are closed, and hundreds of thousands take to the streets day after day. Lebanon is just the latest country in the Arab world where the people have said enough to economic stagnation and corruption. So far this year, mass protests have brought down authoritarian regimes in Algeria and Sudan, and others have been shaken by unrest. In Iraq, security forces killed almost 150 people protesting high unemployment, corruption, and the lack of the most basic public services in an oil-rich country where the powerful have siphoned off billions. For the first time in years, Egypt has seen anti-regime protests where the poor are getting poorer and the generals who run the country get richer and richer. Each country is different, but they have a lot in common, says activist Rania Al-Masri.
The frustration of all these peoples is the same. It's frustration against unemployment, frustration against poverty, frustration against governmental corruption and governmental impotence. So the frustration across it is the same. And we could argue it's a frustration against neoliberalism. It's a frustration against this kind of capitalism on steroids.
From Beirut, it's a pattern.
We are enduring very similar circumstances in terms of the dictatorships we live under, whether it is the economic situations we have to live by, whether unemployment, all the different patterns that we have in the region.
Nearly 9 years ago, the so-called Arab Spring toppled dictators in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, and sparked the bloody war in Syria. And with the possible exception of Tunisia, it was an experiment that went terribly wrong. But this time, what's different is the focus, not on politics, but rather economics. The main driver now seems to be anger over falling standards of living, coupled with the widely held belief that the ruling class, elected or otherwise, has been on a prolonged looting spree. The veil is slipping. Governments and regimes that exploited divisions, that stoked fears, that enriched themselves and impoverished their populations appear to be losing their grip. What happens in Lebanon may not stay in Lebanon. And now these protests are in their 8th day. They show no sign of letting up. But at the same time, we're seeing the government really isn't giving much ground either. So the situation we can fairly reliably predict is going to continue and perhaps escalate. Lynda?
Yeah, they are the fears, really. Ben Wiedemann for us in Beirut. Good to have you with us. Thanks so much. Well, Chile is bracing for another day of violent demonstrations as protesters demand the resignation of President Sebastián Piñera. At least 18 people have now been killed in a week of protests as anger over the cost of living and income inequality boils over. The president tried to calm things Thursday morning, announcing the cancellation of energy price hikes. But protest organizers say it isn't nearly enough. Well, right next door in Bolivia, tensions also boiling over there. Angry protesters taking to the streets, accusing authorities of fraud. They claim Sunday's vote was rigged and say President Evo Morales is trying to steal the election. Preliminary results initially indicated a tight race. Just hours ago, the president declared victory, but said he is open to holding a runoff if necessary. Well, let's bring in CNN's Gustavo Valdez in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. Gustavo, so this unrest there in Bolivia started, of course, over concerns about fraud in the election. Rather than calming the situation, though, the president there essentially declaring that a coup is underway.
Exactly. Hi, Lynda. That's exactly what the president said this morning, even though we haven't heard the final results of these elections. Right now, we're in front of the statue of Christ the Redeemer here in Santa Cruz. This is a place where traditionally people gather to protest or to express any kind of gathering regarding politics or celebrating a soccer match, for instance. This time you can see it's empty. And that is because civic groups and opposition parties have called for a national strike. People are not leaving their homes. Businesses are not working. It's been a peaceful 36 hours, mostly peaceful in this area and many parts of the country where people are staying home, showing their disagreement with the announcement of the early results. What happened on Sunday night, shortly after the election was over and the first numbers came out, President Morales had about 7 points difference advantage over the second place on the race. That meant at that point that a second round would be forced on the president, who hasn't been on a second round in 3 terms that he's been serving. At that point, there was a sudden stop to the count of votes. And hours later, they came back, and the president was within tens of decimal points of being within the 10% margin he needs to avoid a second round. And that's when people got angry in many parts of the country. And that's when they called for general strike in many provinces in this country. And some of them have been clashes between Evo Morales supporters and people who think this is a fraud. In fact, right now, earlier today, President Morales went to one of the strongholds in Cochabamba, about 6-hour drive from where we are, and he showed that he has people behind him that are going to fight for him to serve this 4th term if the results stand. The people we've talked to here in Santa Cruz, which is the largest city in the country, the most important financially, they felt cheated twice. Why? Because in 2016, President Morales called a referendum that would allow him to get reelected indefinitely. He lost that referendum, but then the Supreme Court said that he was indeed allowed to run for president as many times as he wishes. And now, after having been elected by by about 60% of the vote in the past two elections. He barely got over 40% at this time, and he needs that 10% margin between the second place so he can avoid the second round. The question is, what is going to happen when the official results are announced? Will the protests we're seeing peaceful right now will escalate, or will the people that support President Morales will get upset if he doesn't get that 10% he needs?
All right, we'll see how this all plays out. Certainly a lot of fear on the streets. Gustavo, good to have you there for us. Thank you. Well, still to come tonight, police in the UK believe the 39 bodies found in a truck were all Chinese nationals. We'll tell you what else authorities are learning in their international investigation coming up next. And then dozens of US Republican lawmakers disrupt closed-door impeachment proceedings on Capitol Hill in a stunt apparently sanctioned by President Donald Trump.